What would you do if someone erased your family's legacy with a single bulldozer? For me, that was the moment everything changed. The morning they tore down my great-grandfather's bridge was the same morning I swore their $4 million lakefront resort would end up as nothing more than a muddy parking lot. It's 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I'm sitting on my dock sipping coffee when the low growl of diesel engines cuts through the mist. Through the fog, I catch sight of a bulldozer rolling toward the stone bridge my great-grandfather laid by hand in 1923. That bridge had stood for a century, linking our community together. But to one power-drunk HOA president, it was nothing but an eyesore. What Linda Prescott and her polished HOA board didn't understand was that Texas water rights aren't so easily ignored. My great-grandfather hadn't just built a bridge, he had built and controlled the dam itself. And now that authority belongs to me, which means I inherited something stronger than their bylaws, the legal right to drain their entire lake. So let me ask you, if someone destroyed your family's history, what would you do? And where are you tuning in from? I want to hear how many of you have had to deal with HOA bullies like this. My name's Jake Morrison. I'm a civil engineer, and just 3 months ago I inherited one of the most breathtaking pieces of lakefront property you could imagine. My great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, built our family cabin back in 1920, right after returning from the Great War. But his true masterpiece was the bridge. Sam didn't just hammer together a few planks, he hand-cut limestone blocks from the local quarry and shaped them into a proper stone arch that connected our side of the lake to the main road. For generations, that bridge served everyone: fishermen on their way to favorite spots, children trekking to swimming holes, neighbors crossing to help neighbors. It was the heartbeat of our little community. When I inherited the land, my wife Sarah and I dreamed of our future there. We'd been saving every penny, hoping to retire in a few years. I'd fix up the old cabin, maybe take on consulting work from home, and spend my mornings fishing off the dock. The creak of those worn planks beneath my boots was a kind of lullaby. But then came Linda Prescott. She's the sort who wears pearls to the grocery store and drives a spotless white BMW that's never touched a gravel road. 2 years ago, she moved into Whispering Pines, the luxury development that sprouted up across the lake like mushrooms after rain. Within 6 months, she'd schemed her way into the HOA presidency. I should have known trouble was brewing the day I received that first certified letter. The envelope carried that heavy, official weight, the kind that makes your stomach sink before you even open it. Inside was a sugar-coated notice on letterhead declaring that my bridge violated community architectural standards. I couldn't help but laugh, actually laugh out loud. My bridge had stood long before her subdivision was anything more than cow pasture. But Linda thought she was clever. The letter she sent quoted HOA Covenant 47B, architectural review requirements, and warned me of $500 daily fines if I didn't remove the bridge within 30 days. That's when I started digging through dusty boxes in my grandfather's attic. The smell of old paper and time clung to everything, but what I found mattered. Original survey maps, deed records, and best of all, the grandfathering clause that specifically protected existing structures. My bridge was older than the HOA by 8 decades. Armed with proof, I walked into the next HOA meeting at the community center. You know that distinct smell of waxed floors, burnt coffee, and stale frustration? That was my welcome to HOA politics. I spread those documents across the folding table like a poker player laying down a royal flush. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said calmly, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Linda barely glanced at my papers. Her reply still makes my blood boil. "Times change, Mr. Morrison. Progress requires sacrifice." She said it with a patronizing smile, like she was teaching a child to count. The vote was already decided, 5-2 in favor of enforcement. Linda's loyalists, wealthy newcomers with no sense of history, outnumbered the old-timers who still remembered what community meant. As I walked back to my truck, gravel crunching under my boots, the truth sank in. This wasn't about architecture or community standards. It was about control. Linda looked at my modest bridge, my weathered cabin, my beat-up pickup, and decided I didn't belong in her glossy vision of an upscale lakeside neighborhood. She wanted me erased. Sarah tried to keep our spirits up. "We'll fight this together," she told me over dinner, squeezing my hand across our little kitchen table. "You've got the law on your side." I nodded and forced a smile, but deep down, I wondered if being right
would be enough. What I didn't realize yet was that Linda had picked a fight with the wrong man. I wasn't just an engineer who knew about codes and property law. I understood water. Linda wasted no time escalating. 3 days after that meeting, I was heading out to work when I noticed 2 men in matching polo shirts standing at my property line. Security guards. At 7 in the morning on a Wednesday? "Mornin', fellas," I called, coffee mug in hand. "Y'all lost?" The older one, built like a retired linebacker, pulled out a clipboard. "HOA business. Compliance patrol, sir. We're here to document violations." I almost spit my coffee. Violations? Like what? The man flipped through his clipboard with all the enthusiasm of reading a grocery list. Grass exceeds HOA's 3-inch standard. Dock requires repainting per aesthetic guidelines. Storage shed needs pressure washing. Over the next 2 weeks, these clowns cited me for everything short of breathing too loudly. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My welcome mat didn't meet compliance dimensions. They even wrote me up for leaving a fishing net visible from the road. By week 3, I was already staring at $1,200 in fines. That's when I did what any engineer would do when facing a problem. I studied the system. And what I found was telling. Linda's husband, Rick, owned Prescott Security Solutions. Cute, right? The HOA was cutting him checks for $3,000 a month to send guards out and harass homeowners into compliance. One evening, I dug into the state contractor licensing website and found something interesting. Rick's security license had expired 6 months earlier. He'd been operating illegally the entire time. Here's a tip for you. Texas requires HOA security companies to be licensed like any other private firm, and most aren't. Always check credentials before letting them fine you. But I wasn't finished. I called a favor from a buddy who does commercial inspections, and one Saturday morning we took a quiet walk around Linda's property. Her spotless image didn't hold up well. That deck extension? Built with no permits. The pool house? 6 inches over the setback line. And her prized Japanese garden? According to the old survey I found, 3 feet over my property line. She'd been trespassing for 3 years. The following Monday, I filed complaints with the state licensing board against Rick's company and requested an official survey of the property. I didn't grandstand. I handled it like any other engineering project. Document everything, follow procedure, and let facts do the talking. Linda's retaliation came quickly. Within a week, whispers started floating around the hardware store. Jake Morrison's difficult. His bridge is dragging down property values. Some folks just don't understand progress. Sarah came home from the grocery store one Thursday looking upset. The cashier wouldn't meet her eye, and Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop acted like she'd come down with the plague. Then the anonymous complaints started rolling in. Someone called the county claiming my bridge was structurally unsafe. Another concerned neighbor accused me of dumping chemicals into the lake, which was laughable considering I'm an environmental engineer who tests water quality for a living. But here's the kicker. This was where Linda made her first real mistake. While she was busy playing neighborhood politician, I was doing what I do best, reading technical documents. I'd filed a public records request for everything related to water rights and dam operations on our lake. Buried in those dusty county files, I found something that made me sit up straight at my kitchen table. There were maps I'd never seen before, showing water flow patterns from the 1920s, engineering reports from my great-grandfather's time, and, most importantly, documentation of secondary water rights that had never been transferred to the HOA. That weekend, I circled the lake with a surveyor's eye, paying close attention to how the water moved.
And that's when I saw it. The resort Linda kept bragging about, the one she claimed would elevate our community, was sitting on a glaring vulnerability. Their entire business model depended on stable water levels. The boat docks, the lakefront dining, the million-dollar fountains and water features, every last piece of it assumed the lake would always stay exactly where it was. The stench of diesel still lingered from their construction, and I couldn't help but taste the irony. Linda had obsessed over tearing down my little stone bridge, but she'd never once considered the bigger picture. I drove home that evening with a new kind of clarity. Linda thought she was playing chess, moving her HOA pawns to push me off the board. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't just another homeowner she could intimidate. I was the guy who understood how the water worked. Her next move came with all the subtlety of a freight train. One Tuesday morning, as I worked,
In my home office, I heard trucks outside. Not one, 3 county vehicles. Out stepped a man in a hard hat, carrying the kind of clipboard that ruins your day. "Jake Morrison?" he asked. I nodded. "We've received an anonymous tip about structural concerns with your bridge. I'm here for a safety evaluation." Anonymous tip? Sure. I could practically smell Linda's expensive perfume in the morning air. The inspection dragged on for 4 hours. The poor guy crawled over every inch of my great-grandfather's stonework with calipers and moisture meters. When he finally finished, he looked almost embarrassed. "Mr. Morrison, your bridge is as solid as the day it was built," he admitted. Then he glanced at his clipboard. "But current code requires seismic reinforcement for a structure of this size. Estimated cost for compliance? $3,000. You've got 10 days to submit improvement plans, or we'll have to condemn it." $3,000? For earthquake protection? In Texas? The biggest seismic event here was when they blasted rock for the new highway. But Linda wasn't stupid. She was calculated. The inspector handed me a business card along with the citation. In neat block letters, it read, "Prescott Construction." Rick Prescott offered to handle the work for $12,000. "Can have it done in a week," he said. I stared at that business card like it had fangs. Rick Prescott, Linda's husband, conveniently volunteering to fix the mess his wife had caused for 12 grand. What a coincidence. That night, I started making calls. First stop, the State Contractor Licensing Board, where a helpful woman named Maria pulled up Rick's file. "Sir, Mr. Prescott's contractor license expired 24 months ago. He's not legally authorized to perform construction work for hire." Next, I rang a friend at the county building department. "Jake, that seismic requirement only applies to new construction and major renovations," he told me. "Existing structures are grandfathered unless they're actually unsafe." Here's another nugget for you. Water rights in the American West often predate modern property law. They can override HOA rules, zoning, and sometimes even eminent domain. Armed with that tip, I dove back into the county archives to study the water rights paperwork. What I unearthed made my hands tremble. My great-grandfather hadn't merely built a bridge and a cabin. He'd held secondary water rights to the entire lake system, granted back when this place was still ranchland. Those rights included something called flow management authority. In plain English, I could legally control how much water stayed in the lake. I spent 2 days poring over 1920s-era engineering reports about the dam. It was fascinating. Turns out the original designers had installed bypass channels to redirect water around the main dam. My great-grandfather's bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was sited to control a secondary spillway system. Meanwhile, Linda kept working her social campaign. She somehow convinced 3 neighbors I was unstable and dangerous. I came home to find security cameras newly aimed at my property from 2 different houses. "Honey, Mrs. Rodriguez won't even wave anymore," Sarah said. "Tom at the marina treated me like I had the plague when I stopped by for bait." The last straw was when Linda filed for a restraining order, claiming I'd threatened the dam and posed a clear danger to community safety. The judge tossed it. The evidence was nothing more than my public records requests and questions at HOA meetings. But the damage was done. Half the neighborhood now treated me like some kind of unhinged threat.
That's when I found something in the resort's environmental impact study that changed everything. Buried in the fine print, I found the detail that shifted everything. The resort's bank loan carried strict requirements for water levels. If the lake dropped below a certain depth, their entire $4 million loan would come due immediately. The timing couldn't have been worse for them. The grand opening was 3 months away. Deposits had already rolled in for weddings, corporate retreats, and fishing tournaments. Linda's own family had sunk $500,000 of their savings into the project. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at those loan documents and had a realization. Linda thought she was waging a fight about HOA bylaws and neighborhood aesthetics. What she hadn't grasped was that she was battling someone who understood the one element her entire development relied on: water. Water doesn't care about HOA rules. It follows physics and legal precedent, and I was beginning to see that I held more leverage than any HOA president ever dreamed of. The metallic taste of stress that had lived on my tongue for weeks was gone, replaced by something sharper, cleaner: the taste of possibility. Linda's patience broke the week before Thanksgiving. I was checking my mailbox when I saw her storming across the street in those ridiculous white heels. Clutching a manila envelope like it contained nuclear launch codes. "Mr. Morrison," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting. Your bridge is an immediate safety crisis that cannot wait for normal procedures." She shoved the envelope at me hard enough to slice my thumb. Inside was a notice: "Crisis Intervention Meeting, scheduled for the following evening. One agenda item: vote to authorize immediate bridge removal, with or without my consent." The meeting was chaos. Linda paraded in her golf partner from Dallas, a so-called structural engineer who'd never even laid eyes on my bridge, but was more than willing to brand it a death trap. His slides were littered with terms like catastrophic failure risk and imminent public danger. Real professional work. The board didn't hesitate. The vote was swift and merciless, 7-1. The board voted 7-1 in favor of immediate removal. The lone dissent came from Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old resident who'd lived here since the 1960s. Everyone else had either been bought, bullied, or persuaded that I was some sort of bridge-building lunatic. "Demolition begins tomorrow morning," Linda announced, her delight barely hidden. "Removal fees of $15,000 will be charged to Mr. Morrison's account. Failure to pay within 30 days will result in a lien against the property." $15,000 to erase something my great-grandfather had crafted with his bare hands. I drove home in a daze, the rough grain of my steering wheel the only thing keeping me grounded. Sarah saw my face, didn't ask a question, and quietly poured 2 glasses of wine. That night, I did something I'd never done in my engineering career. I filed an emergency injunction in county court. Not because I was sure it would succeed, but because I had run out of other options. The hearing was set for 9 a.m. the next morning, precisely when Linda's contractor was scheduled to start demolition. At 8:30, I walked into the courthouse carrying a banker's box stuffed with evidence: water rights documents, contractor licensing violations, proof of HOA fund misuse, and structural reports showing my bridge was sturdier than most county roads. Judge Martinez listened for all of 12 minutes before delivering his ruling. Emergency injunction granted. 30-day restraining order issued. Mr. Morrison, you now have 1 month to resolve this through proper legal channels. I called Linda from the courthouse parking lot. "Demolition's canceled," I told her. "You might want to let your contractor know." The silence was so long I thought she'd hung up. Then came her voice, cold as ice. "This is war, Mr. Morrison. I hope you understand that." Here's knowledge nugget number 3. Emergency injunctions can freeze HOA actions if you prove immediate, irreversible harm, but you need hard evidence, not just anger. That same afternoon, I stumbled onto something that made Linda's war declaration seem almost petty. While reviewing HOA financial records, which are public, by the way, I spotted some odd discrepancies. Over the last year, Linda had authorized $30,000 in legal consultations and emergency contractor services. Every single payment traced back to companies owned by Linda's husband or her brother-in-law. I spent the weekend acting like a forensic accountant, cross-checking transactions against business licenses and corporate filings. What I uncovered was staggering. Linda hadn't just been siphoning HOA funds to harass me. She'd been bleeding the community treasury like it was her private bank account. But the real bombshell came when I unearthed the original 1923 engineering survey of the lake. My great-grandfather hadn't merely built a bridge, he'd designed it as part of a control structure for what the old documents called secondary flow management. The bridge wasn't just a crossing, it was a key piece of a broader water control system tied directly to the main dam. I sat for hours over those faded blueprints, the musty smell of paper thick in my kitchen, tracing water flow patterns with my finger. The more I studied, the clearer it became. Linda had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She thought she was fighting some stubborn working-class homeowner, but my great-grandfather had been the chief engineer of this entire lake system. He had built in redundancies, safeguards, and control mechanisms, and the bridge was one of them. That Sunday night, I called my old professor from A&M, an expert in historical water rights law. After I laid out the situation, silence stretched across the line. Finally, he said, "Jake, if what you're telling me is accurate, you don't just own a bridge, you own water management authority for the entire lake system. That's not HOA jurisdiction, that's federal water rights law." I hung up and walked out to my dock. The November air was sharp and clean, carrying the promise of winter. For the first time in months, I smiled. Linda
Had declared war, but she had no clue about the weapons I could wield. That night, the lake dropped exactly 18.5 inches in 6 hours. By sunset, the resort's million-dollar boat docks sat stranded in mud, and their grand opening was canceled on the spot. The bank called their loan that same evening. But here's the truth about water. It's patient and it's fair. Within 24 hours, I restored normal flow to the lake. Suddenly, the investors were eager to negotiate with the man who controlled their water supply. James Chen, the lead investor, approached me with an offer I could actually respect. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "we'd like to propose a partnership. You maintain your bridge as a historic landmark. We get guaranteed water levels. Everyone wins." 3 months later, the resort reopened under new leadership, and Linda was gone. Last I heard, she'd packed up and moved to Arizona after facing federal charges for attempted bribery and misusing HOA funds. Her husband, Rick, lost his contractor's license for good and ended up selling their house just to cover legal fees. The HOA elected a new board, led by Mrs. Chen and Tom Rodriguez, who immediately designated the Morrison Bridge Historic District. My great-grandfather's bridge became the centerpiece of a heritage trail that drew more visitors than Linda's luxury resort dream ever could. Property values didn't plummet like Linda had threatened. Instead, they rose. People preferred living in a community with real history and supportive neighbors over one dominated by corporate developments. Sarah and I used our unexpected local fame to establish the Samuel Morrison Water Rights Scholarship at Texas A&M, supporting engineering students. Funded by speaking fees from the dozen water rights conferences where I've shared this story, the scholarship has already helped 5 students pursue environmental engineering. The first recipient, Maria Rodriguez, Tom's daughter, specialized in sustainable water management and has already accepted a role with the State Water Authority after her upcoming graduation. Fittingly, the award ceremony was held on the bridge, with the entire community there to celebrate. Tom was promoted to resort manager and rehired the employees Linda had dismissed during her reign.
The resort now donates 5% of its profits to local schools and sponsors an annual Bridge Day festival celebrating our history. Frank Wilson even came out of retirement to train me on advanced dam operations, and I've since become a consultant for 3 other lake communities caught in similar HOA battles. Turns out there are plenty of Lindas out there, and plenty of forgotten water rights waiting to be rediscovered. Our case set a precedent, now cited in a dozen other federal water rights disputes across Texas. Patricia likes to remind me that this probably saved dozens of communities from being bulldozed by developers who thought money could outmuscle century-old law. Today, my great-grandfather's bridge is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Each morning, I walk across those limestone blocks he laid with his own hands, and I can almost hear him laughing at how his water system saved the day. The resort thrives, the community is stronger than ever, and our little lake now serves as a model for how history and progress can coexist when people choose cooperation over domination. Linda Saga became a cautionary tale of unchecked HOA power. Just last month, the state legislature passed the Morrison Act, requiring all HOA boards to honor pre-existing water rights, and small victories add up over time. Sarah and I are expecting our first child next spring, and I can already picture them running across that old stone bridge, learning to fish from the same dock where my grandfather once taught me. Some legacies are worth protecting, even when the fight feels impossible. These days, our new neighbors actually enjoy having us around. We've become the go-to hosts for community barbecues, and I've even helped 3 homeowners navigate their own HOA disputes without draining a single lake. If you're facing your own HOA nightmare, remember this: knowledge is power. History matters, and sometimes the sharpest weapon against bureaucratic bullies is knowing the law better than they do. Share your HOA horror story in the comments. I read them all, and I've always got ideas for handling these petty tyrants. And if you'd like to hear about the corrupt city council that tried to steal an elderly farmer's land through eminent domain, and how century-old mineral rights saved her farm, hit that subscribe button. That one's coming soon. Now the sound of children's laughter echoes across the old stone bridge, mixing with the calm rhythm of water that flows exactly where it belongs. But peace never lasts long. Friday morning brought the kind of chaos that makes you question reality. I was sipping coffee on my porch when 3 sheriff's deputies pulled up, followed by Linda in her spotless BMW and 2 men in sharp suits who radiated federal lawyer. Jake Morrison, the lead deputy, said, looking almost apologetic, "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of criminal threatening and conspiracy to commit environmental terrorism." Environmental terrorism for exercising century-old water rights my family had legally held? Patricia had warned me this might come, and within 2 hours I was bonded out and sitting in her Austin office while she worked her magic with federal authorities. Linda's high-priced Blackstone lawyers had managed to convince a federal judge that my water rights posed a threat to interstate commerce and environmental stability. The restraining order was sweeping. I couldn't approach the dam, couldn't operate any water controls, couldn't even speak about water management in public. Linda had used the federal court system to strip away my leverage. But when Patricia finished reading the order, she smiled. "Jake," she said, "they just handed us the proof we needed. This order acknowledges your water rights exist. They're just temporarily restricting them. That's federal recognition of your claim." Within 6 hours, Patricia had filed her own. A federal lawsuit was filed citing violations of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. Even more importantly, Patricia secured a counter-injunction that overruled the local restraining order. Federal water rights always trump local criminal complaints, she explained. Linda's lawyers had, without realizing it, handed us exactly the precedent we needed. Here's the key takeaway. Enforcement of federal water rights can override local law enforcement actions when historical claims predate state and local authority. But Linda wasn't finished with her scorched earth campaign. That same afternoon, I learned she had hired a private security firm to guard the dam around the clock. And not just any firm. These were ex-military contractors who looked like they'd stepped straight out of an action movie. Then Sarah came home from the grocery store with news that made my stomach twist. "Jake," she said, "news trucks are parked at the end of our street, and Mrs. Patterson says Linda is telling everyone you're planning to poison the water supply." Poison the water supply? Linda had escalated from harassment to full-blown character assassination. By the weekend, the media circus was in full swing. Local TV stations were running stories about domestic eco-terrorism and water rights extremism. Linda appeared on 3 different programs, playing the part of the concerned community leader protecting innocent families from a supposedly deranged man with dangerous expertise. But media attention cuts both ways. By Sunday, property rights organizations from across Texas were calling to offer support. Environmental lawyers volunteered their services. Even some resort employees quietly reached out to say they were on my side. The community was splitting down the middle. Longtime residents who remembered my great-grandfather rallied behind my family's legacy, while newer residents, terrified their property values might plummet, threw their support behind Linda's development agenda. Monday morning brought Linda's nuclear option. The HOA board called an emergency community protection meeting and voted to authorize any and all measures necessary to keep me from accessing the dam. In practice, that meant hiring armed guards to block me from exercising my federally protected water rights. That's when Frank Wilson made a decision that changed everything. At 6 a.m., my phone rang. Frank's voice was calm, but his words made my hands tremble. "Jake," he said, "I've been running this dam for 30 years. I've never seen a mess like this over something so simple. I'm retiring effective immediately, and I'm recommending you as interim dam operator under your water rights authority." With federal water rights and official operational authority in hand, Linda's private security team no longer had any legal grounds to stop me from carrying out routine maintenance, including inspections of the secondary flow channels. Then the final piece of the puzzle landed. Tom Rodriguez called with evidence that would forever destroy Linda's credibility. He had been wearing a wire during his conversations with the sheriff's department, secretly recording Linda's bribery attempts. "Jake, she offered me $15,000 yesterday," Tom said. "Told me if I could make it look like you sabotaged the controls yourself, she'd guarantee me a promotion and a raise. I've got the whole thing on tape. 15 grand for perjury?" Linda had just stepped out of civil conflict and into the territory of federal felony crimes. That evening, Sarah and I sat together on our dock, listening to the soft lap of water against the pilings. The scent of approaching rain hung heavy in the air, and I could almost taste the electricity of the storm rolling in. "Tomorrow's the day," I told her. "Linda's made her choice, and now I have to make mine." Sarah squeezed my hand gently. "Your great-grandfather would be proud," she whispered. "Sometimes standing up for what's right means making hard choices." Tuesday morning would prove the truth of her words. Because some battles aren't decided by the side with the most expensive lawyers or the loudest media presence. Sometimes they're won by the one who understands the law, the physics of water, and the gravity of family legacy. The next day dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning that sharpens every detail. I arrived at the dam at 8 a.m. with Patricia, Frank, and a small army of reporters who had been covering the case for weeks. Linda was already there, flanked by her private security contractors, 3 sheriff's deputies, and a wall of lawyers that looked like an entire firm. She planted herself in front of the dam controls like some self-appointed guardian of the environment, her voice trembling with desperation masked as authority. "You will not pass," she declared for the cameras. "I am protecting this community from a dangerous individual who threatens our way of life." Channel 8 News had their cameras rolling. Even the county sheriff had shown up, overseeing what everyone knew would be the decisive showdown. Some of the resort's investors had even driven down from Dallas, probably calculating just how much money they were about to lose. I walked toward the concrete housing that protected the bypass controls, carrying with me a folder containing a century's worth of legal documentation and Frank's official letter transferring dam operation authority to me. I turned to the assembled crowd and spoke firmly, my voice carrying across the crisp morning air. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to perform routine maintenance on secondary water management systems that have been operated by my family since 1923. Linda stepped right in front of me, close enough that I could smell the mix of her expensive perfume and the sharp sting of panic sweat. "I have a federal restraining order preventing you from approaching this equipment," she snapped. Patricia moved forward smoothly, handing a document to the sheriff. "Your Honor, that restraining order was superseded last night by federal water rights enforcement. Mr. Morrison has full legal authority to operate these systems." The sheriff scanned the document, gave a small nod, and stepped aside. "Ma'am, he has federal jurisdiction here. You need to move back." That was when Linda truly lost control. "This is insane," she screamed at the cameras. "You're going to let this lunatic destroy a $4 million investment because of some piece of paper from 1923? People like him don't belong in our community. People like him." On live television, Linda had revealed what the fight had really been about all along. It wasn't about HOA rules, architectural standards, or community safety. It was about class, about who she believed deserved to belong in her carefully manufactured vision of an exclusive lakefront paradise. I knelt beside the concrete housing and began loosening the access panel with the tools Frank had given me. Each bolt came free with a metallic ring that seemed to echo finality, and the crowd held its breath in silence. "Mr. Morrison," a reporter from Channel 8 called out, "can you explain exactly what you're doing?" Without looking up from my work, I replied, "I'm opening secondary flow channels designed by my great-grandfather in 1923. These channels allow controlled release of excess water during maintenance operations. Everything I'm doing is completely legal under federal water rights law and standard dam operation procedures." The access panel finally dropped free, revealing the massive brass wheel that controlled the bypass valves. Frank had oiled the mechanism just a week earlier, and it turned with surprising ease for something nearly 100 years old. Linda made one last desperate attempt to stop me. "Sheriff, he's going to drain our lake. He's destroying private property. Arrest him." Sheriff Martinez gave her the weary look of a man who had dealt with far too many HOA disputes. "Ma'am, this is federal jurisdiction and lawful dam operations. I can't arrest a man for turning a valve he has legal authority to operate." I gripped the wheel and gave it 3 full turns clockwise. Deep within the structure, the century-old mechanisms responded exactly as Samuel Morrison had intended. Water began to move. Water surged through the secondary channels with a deep, throaty rumble that seemed to rise straight from the earth itself. The crowd stood transfixed as the lake level began to fall before their eyes. Within 20 minutes, the water line had already pulled back from the resort's dock pilings. Linda was frozen in place, watching her $4 million investment quite literally drain away. When she finally found her voice, it was barely more than a whisper. "You can't do this. You can't just destroy everything we've built." I stood, brushed the dirt from my hands, and faced the cameras for what I knew would be my final statement. "Mrs. Prescott, I offered you compromise. I offered you negotiation. I offered you respect for both your investment and my family's legacy. You chose war instead. This is what losing a water rights war looks like." The resort's boat docks were already unusable, and by nightfall the entire shoreline would be nothing but exposed mud. Linda's much-touted grand opening, scheduled for the following weekend, was doomed. But the most beautiful sound of that morning wasn't the rushing water or the frantic clicking of cameras. It was Mrs. Chen's steady voice rising clearly across the gathering. "Welcome home, Jake. Your great-grandfather would be proud." The next Monday, I drove to the county archives with the kind of focused determination I usually reserved for major engineering projects. Dorothy, the patient clerk who had been working there since the Carter administration, helped me sift through every document related to the 1923 dam construction. What I found changed everything. Buried in a file labeled Historical Water Management, Lake Morrison System, was the original construction contract, not just for the dam, but for the entire water control network. My great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, hadn't been some farmer tinkering with stonework. He had been the chief hydraulic engineer for the whole project. The critical document was a water rights agreement dated March 15, 1923. In dense legal language that took me 3 readings to untangle, it granted Samuel Morrison and his heirs perpetual secondary water rights, including full flow management authority for Lake Morrison and all connected tributaries. Flow management authority. Those 3 words meant I didn't just have permission to use the water. I had the legal power to decide how much stayed in the lake. And then came the real bombshell. The resort's bank loan documents, which were public record thanks to county tax incentives, contained strict performance clauses. If the lake level dropped more than 18 inches below full capacity for over 72 hours, the entire $4 million construction loan would be called due immediately. 18 inches. I ran the math in my head. The implications were staggering. The lake was already 22 inches below the spillway, and I knew that if I opened the secondary channels my great-grandfather had designed, I could drop it another 18 inches in less than 6 hours. The resort had already collected more than $200,000 in deposits for its grand opening weekend. Weddings, corporate retreats, fishing tournaments, all based on the promise of a pristine lake. Linda's family had poured in $500,000 of their own money, and Rick had even co-signed the loan with their house as collateral. Sitting in that archive room, surrounded by the smell of old paper and bureaucratic dust, I realized I was holding a nuclear weapon in this war over water rights. The weight of it pressed on me immediately. This wasn't just about Linda anymore. The resort employed 43 people, waitresses, groundskeepers, boat captains, cleaning staff, most of them locals who depended on those jobs. But Linda had made this fight personal. She'd tried to erase 4 generations of my family's history. She'd funneled community money into her own pockets. She'd turned neighbors against one another and treated our lake like her private kingdom. That afternoon, I walked the dam with an engineer's eye instead of a grandson's nostalgia. The 1920s design was brilliant in its simplicity. My great-grandfather Samuel Morrison had hidden manual bypass valves into the structure, buried under decades of moss and rust but still working. The irony was almost poetic. Linda had spent months obsessing over HOA architectural rules while sitting on top of a water system I could control with a few turns of a century-old valve wheel. That evening, I made the decision that would define everything that came after. I would not use the nuclear option immediately. Linda deserved one final chance to step back, to negotiate like a reasonable adult instead of a bully. But if she refused, if she kept escalating, kept trying to destroy my family's legacy, then she would learn the hard way that some wars aren't decided by the wealthiest lawyers or the flashiest development plans. They're decided by the person who understands the physics of water and the gravity of history. I walked back to my cabin that night with an unexpected sense of calm. For the first time in months, I felt like I was the one holding the high ground. I wasn't the underdog anymore. I wasn't the man being shoved around by petty authority and bureaucratic red tape. I was the one who could drain their lake. The very next morning, I began assembling my team. My first call was to Patricia Gomez, a water rights attorney in Austin who specialized in historical claims. Her reputation alone carried weight. She had defended ranchers against corporate water grabs and knew Texas water law better than most judges on the bench. After I explained everything, she said, "Jake, if your documentation is as solid as you say, you're not just playing with a strong hand. You're holding a royal flush in a game where the others think they're playing checkers." She agreed to take the case on contingency, which told me all I needed to know about her confidence. She promised to drive up the following weekend to review the documents and evaluate our position. My next call was to Frank Wilson, the old veteran who had operated the dam for 3 decades. Frank had worked alongside men who had learned directly from my great-grandfather. If anyone understood the mechanical heart of the system, it was him. Over coffee at the diner, he shook his head with a half-smile. "Your granddaddy was a smart man, built redundancy into everything. These new resort folks don't even know those bypass channels exist, haven't been touched since the drought of '86. Frank agreed to walk me through the controls and explain precisely how the manual systems worked. Even more importantly, he confirmed that everything I planned was not only legal, but also within the boundaries of normal dam operations. My team was forming quickly. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor and the lone ally I had on the HOA board, introduced me to Tom Rodriguez, a maintenance worker at the resort. Tom was in a tight spot. He needed his paycheck, but he'd grown up fishing off my great-grandfather's bridge and understood its meaning for the community. "Most of us employees know Linda's bad news," Tom confided. "She treats the staff like servants and the local contractors like dirt. But we can't afford to risk our jobs over principles." Meanwhile, Sarah's sister Monica, a paralegal in Dallas, stepped up to help with research. Within 48 hours, she had assembled a detailed file on Linda's financial irregularities and her violations of HOA rules. The evidence was devastating. Linda had essentially been embezzling community funds for months. That was the first revelation that shaped how I approached building a legal strategy. Water rights attorneys often charge $300 an hour, but when historical claims are backed with strong documentation, they can be worth millions. Patricia laid out the negotiation framework during her weekend visit. We'd present Linda with a compromise that allowed her to save face. I keep my bridge, she retains architectural approval authority over all new construction, the resort secures guaranteed minimum water levels, and Linda gets to claim victory as the defender of community standards. But at the same time, we quietly prepared the nuclear option. If Linda refused to negotiate, I had the legal authority to fully exercise my water management rights, which included routine maintenance of the secondary flow channels, actions that could conveniently lower the lake below the resort's loan threshold. The timing was perfect. Spring runoff season was ending, meaning any water I released would not be naturally replenished for months. By the time the lake recovered, the resort's summer season would already be lost. Frank walked me through the mechanics one quiet Tuesday morning. The bypass valves were cleverly hidden beneath a concrete housing that blended seamlessly with the original structure. "Your granddaddy built this so one man with basic tools could operate it," Frank explained, showing me the wheel. "Clockwise sends water through the secondary channel, counterclockwise shuts it down." I practiced until I could perform the operation without thinking. The wheel moved with surprising ease for a mechanism that hadn't been touched in decades, a true testament to Samuel Morrison's craftsmanship. Together, we established a clear timeline. I would present Linda with one final opportunity to negotiate at the upcoming HOA meeting. A fair, reasonable offer in front of witnesses. If she accepted, everyone would walk away with something. If she rejected it or escalated the conflict, then I would enforce my rights. By the following Monday, Monica had assembled every document we might need should the situation spill into public view. Property records, water rights certificates, evidence of Linda's financial misconduct, and a clear timeline of her escalating harassment. The message would be impossible to ignore. This was the story of a reasonable homeowner standing against a corrupt HOA president. Sarah and I spent Sunday evening, we sat on our dock watching the sunset cast the lake in shades of golden red. The water lapped softly against the pilings, peaceful yet carrying the weight of change. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her hand slipping into mine. I squeezed her fingers, breathing in the sweet promise of summer on the air. Linda made this choice when she decided my family's legacy was disposable. I'm just making sure she understands the consequences. Tomorrow would be her final chance to end the war she'd started. After that, the lake itself would reveal who truly held the power. Apparently, Linda sensed what was coming. 3 days before the HOA meeting, Patricia called with news that turned my morning coffee to ash. "Jake, they've hired Blackstone and Associates out of Dallas. That's a $2,000 an hour firm that specializes in crushing property rights claims. Someone's serious about this fight." Blackstone wasted no time filing motions that challenged my documentation, dismissing the 1923 agreements as archaic and superseded by modern zoning laws. They even requested an emergency hearing to dissolve my injunction, framing me as an environmental threat to the lake ecosystem. At the same time, Linda's desperation was spilling into the community. Word spread that she'd been calling investors, weaving stories about terrorist plots and sabotage. Her paranoia reached a peak Thursday evening when she called an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was clear: declare me a danger to community safety and authorize whatever measures were needed to protect the resort. I walked into that meeting with Patricia, Frank, and a folder thick with documents that could end her reign once and for all. The community center reeked of nervous sweat and cheap cologne. Linda's supporters had packed the room, their loyalty bought with promises and fear. When the floor opened for public comment, I stood. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present a final proposal for resolving this dispute." I spread my water rights documents across the table, followed by the resort's loan agreements and evidence of Linda's financial misconduct. I keep my bridge as a historically protected structure. In exchange, I guarantee minimum water levels for resort operations and support architectural review for new construction. The silence that followed was electric. You could almost hear Linda's mind racing as her eyes darted over the evidence. Finally, she hissed, "This is extortion. You're threatening to destroy a $4 million investment because you can't follow simple community rules." Patricia rose smoothly. "Mrs. Prescott, my client isn't threatening anything. He's offering to guarantee your water supply." Linda's face went the color of boiled lobster when Patricia finished. "He offers guaranteed water levels in exchange for respecting his grandfathered property rights. That's negotiation." "I don't negotiate with terrorists," Linda snapped. "This board will not be held hostage by environmental extremism." Frank Wilson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, with respect, Jake has legal authority over secondary water management that predates your development by 80 years. This isn't extremism, it's property law." The vote was swift and predictable. The board rejected the compromise 6-2, with only Mrs. Chen and old Mr. Patterson supporting negotiation. Linda strutted out like she'd won. "Mr. Morrison," she announced with theatrical smugness, "your threats hold no power here. This community will not bow to intimidation." The gravel under my boots sounded like a countdown. Linda had been offered a reasonable way out and chose escalation instead. The next morning confirmed her desperation had deepened. Tom Rodriguez called before dawn, voice tight with worry. "Jake, she offered me $10,000 cash to sabotage the dam controls. Said it would look like equipment failure and you'd take the blame." $10,000. Linda had moved from harassment to attempted bribery and outright sabotage. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her I'd think about it," Tom admitted. "I called the sheriff. They opened an investigation and warned me she was getting dangerous." That afternoon, Deputy Martinez visited with a new complaint from Linda alleging I'd made specific terrorist threats against the dam and resort. The deputy was professional but skeptical. "Mr. Morrison, have you made any statements about damaging the resort or threatening public safety?" he asked. I handed him copies of my legal files and Patricia's contact.
Deputy, everything I plan to do is fully legal under state water rights law. If Mrs. Prescott calls lawful dam operations terrorism, that says more about her grasp of the law than my intentions. After he left, I updated Patricia. Her response was immediate. Attempted bribery and false police reports cross a line. We're filing federal charges under water rights interference statutes. But move fast, she warned. If she's this desperate, she might try something actually illegal. That evening, I sat on the dock watching the sun drop and felt the metallic edge of adrenaline.
Linda had rejected negotiation, tried bribery, and filed false reports. She'd made her choice. Monday morning, I would make mine.